Hello, good morning once again from the coast of Asturias. We're back at Playa Huelga, which is a very popular cliff top to the west of Llanes. It's one of the few places on this coast that we regularly see people, but this morning we have it to ourselves, so that's very nice indeed. And as opposed to yesterday when it was pouring with rain, we have been able to get out and photograph a pleasant sunrise. Now, I've been here, as you know, many times, and it's always kind of interesting to come back because, you know, you do get drawn to different things, and I'm very open to this whole concept. So what I've been doing this morning is a couple of things. One is some wildflowers, which are starting to come into bloom, and the second is using the shapes of the foreground rocks to frame the more dynamic sea stack behind. Now, the key thing with a lot of these things is one, contrast. So what I've been doing is I've been rendering an awful lot of the shadows really black and allowing just the highlights to tell the shape. And the second thing is that as you start zooming in to isolate the sea stack within some kind of crevice or some type of framing foreground, to understand depth of field. So when you're at 35 millimeters, you've got more depth of field. You zoom into 50 millimeters or 70 millimeters to make things simpler and less busy. And all of a sudden you've got to make sure that the foreground and the background are in focus. Nothing is easier now with digital cameras because we just look at the preview, and if it's not sharp, we have to take another shot. So in this video I'm going to cover focus stacking, which is so much easier now than it ever has been before. I'm going to cover a couple of the little idiosyncrasies about it using various examples, but this is going to be the subject of this week's video on the Asturias coast, is focus stacking.
In this first example, I like the way the foreground rocks are kind of creating a frame that the back sea stack and cliff can kind of sit in, and there's a bit of mirroring going on in there. Now, this is shot at about 50 millimeters, and the foreground rocks and the background sea stack just can't be sharp because the camera is quite close to the front rocks. And this is just a function of depth of field. So in the next screen captured example, I'm going to show you how we address this using Lightroom and Photoshop to make one photograph that's just a seamless representation of a very pretty scene. So here we have two images in Lightroom which show the scene that I composed in camera with a square crop. I've been doing this for some time now using square crops. I just like the harmony in them, and it's just an area of creativity that I'm exploring rather than cropping after I get back to the computer. I like doing it in the field. So what we're going to have a quick look here is, if we look at both of these images, this image is sharp for the foreground. If I skip through to the next image, you can see that it's not sharp in the foreground, but it's going to be sharp at the back. And I made sure that I had a good focus point in the front for the first frame, and I had a good focus point in the back for the second frame. So this way I have front to back sharpness, but spread over two images. Now, that's not particularly useful until you get to the point of saying, right, let's put them together. So I'm going to select the first image and then shift click to select the second image, take them into the develop module, and I'm going to just check the words auto sync there. So anything I do to the first image will be mirrored by whatever I do to the first image will be mirrored by the second image. So I'm just going to brighten this somewhat to allow the luminosity of the water to really shine through. Now, this dark horizon on the sky here, this is exactly what it looked like. I do have a graduated filter on here coming down from the top, but that's not what's causing this darkening. That's just exactly how the sky was. And I just liked how kind of blue it looked, so I was really quite excited by that. What I'm going to do here is pull down gradient and just zero that effect there. And I'm just going to lift my blacks a tiny fraction just to get rid of some of that darkening that was on the top of the sea stacks there. But this is going to be an image that is actually going to be quite contrasty. And then with a second gradient, I'm going to zero that effect, pull up from the bottom, and I'm actually going to darken that a little bit more, just really until it starts to clip. because again, it's something I want to be reasonably contrasty. I think I might just drop the overall exposure, because I'm not really interested in details here. I'm just interested in a concept, which is about there. So I'm reasonably happy with that as it stands at the moment. So these are the files that I can now look at side by side, and what I've done to one is mirrored with the second. So to take these into Photoshop and focus stack them, it's nothing simpler, nothing harder than to right click and edit and then open as layers in Photoshop. And this will open both the files in Adobe Photoshop as layers. The clue's kind of in the name. So now we have my copy of Adobe Photoshop, and as you'll see, I've got my toolbar down the right hand side. I keep it very simple here. I just have layers and channels, and then properties, history, and actions. That's all I use, and it's all I need. At different times I might have Tony Kuiper's luminosity masks open or something like that, but this is my basic working panel. So the situation that we need to do is we need to select both of these layers, and you do that again by shift clicking, and then we use the path Edit Auto Align Layers. And what this is going to do, leaving that at Auto as the default, what this is going to do is align the front and the back image, and it's going to move things around so that we have commonality of placement, because as you change focus points, things move. When you focus at the back of an image, the foreground is going to shift slightly, and when you focus at the front, the back is going to move slightly. And what this is doing is taking that content and intelligently mushing it up together. Now, something that I like to do, particularly with the way Photoshop blends, is to make copies of these two layers and save them for later. Because the way the next step works is that Photoshop is going to try and take sharp parts of each image and add them together. And what it actually does is it creates these bizarre masks that can't be edited. So if you end up with blotches or patches where the blending hasn't worked very well, particularly in water like this, you can't really override it. So I like to go Command J, which makes me a copy of each layer, and then add a group, and I'm going to call that Originals, and then I'm going to hide that layer. So I've got my two images, my two copies are in that folder, but I'm only going to blend the front two. So I'm going to select both of those and take the second step in the focus stacking process, which is to auto blend. I'm going to let that do its stacked image default, click OK, and depending on the power of your computer and how many layers you're trying to blend, this can take anywhere from a few seconds up to maybe a minute or something like that if you're doing multiple layers. In this particular case, it should be reasonably quick and quite straightforward. And you'll see that what we're going to do is it's going to make this merged layer. And you can see that we've got two masks that exist on these on this image. And it's a really odd thing to do, because if we look at the mask, you can see that it's taking bits of the foreground and bits of the background from each image. So it's a really awkward and bizarre way of doing it, but it's basically saying that these parts of the frame are relevant for this image, and it's masking out the other bits, and it produces a file that has, if I zoom in there, you'll see it has nice front is sharp and the back is also sharp. So it's done its job, but I know fine well that there's bits of this file that are being seen in the final version that look kind of weird to me. So I'm just going to override this. So I'm going to turn on my background layers. I'm going to work out which one is sharp for the back, which is this one. Because if I turn that on again, yeah, so this one is the back and this one is the front. So if I turn off the background, so if I turn off the front layer, I'm seeing 100% of the back layer. And because that's on top of all of this stuff, I'm actually back with an out of focus foreground. So I will stick a black mask on this, and I'll do that by clicking the Alt button and then the mask button. and that makes a black mask which hides that all again, which means I'm now just seeing the merged layer. So I want to paint in the back onto this image because the back has got the water the way I want it to be. So I'm just going to get a white brush and make it reasonably large, and I can use high opacity. I can just come in here and paint in, and this is 100% of the back image just getting painted in there. So now I've got a situation where all of the front is being caused by the merged version and all of the back is being used by this extra version. Now in this particular case I could have just taken these two images, stuck a mask on one of them and painted the other the bit out that I didn't want. But I wanted to demonstrate that aligning and the auto align and the auto blend. Once we get to this point, I can just come in and go layer, flatten image, discard hidden layers, yes, and hit Command S or Control S on a Windows machine. That will save it back into Lightroom, where I can just finish the processing on this quite quickly. So it's brought it back into Lightroom now as a TIFF. So if I double click on that, I now have a version of this file that is front to back sharp. Now I'm just going to finish this off very, very quickly with a bit of very simple processing. I'm just going to make sure it's level. I could have done this all in the front end, but it's not a big deal. In fact, I'm going to check lens corrections first. I'm going to right click here and go into solo mode, so it's going to close a lot of these little things down. I'm going to go into lens collections and make sure that that is checked. I was using a Nikon 2470 lens on this shot and it's pretty good, but it's the old one. Apparently the new one is supposed to be really good also, but I prefer this one. So there we have a level horizon. I'm going to come in and vignette this slightly because I want that dark. I want that feeling of darkness. I'm really only interested in the water here. Now there's a little bright spot down there which can go, which I'm happy with. There's a few other little bits and bobs down in here which I can get rid of too. This just isn't worth doing in Photoshop. I mean, for this quick demonstration, ordinarily I probably would. Now this little snick here on the left hand side, that is something that does bother me a fraction, so I'm just going to pull down the horizon there, keeping the square format. The sky's only there as a context, and I kind of like that. This is very much what I had in my mind when I took the shot, and yeah, I think it's the focus stacking here has really helped to make sure the foreground and the background are super sharp, and it's done its job. In this particular example, you can see how extreme the foreground is and how close it is compared to the background. This is shot at about 60mm, and using exactly the same technique as I've just demonstrated, we can make this work even with 10-second exposures. In the second example, it's exactly the same in that it's the same location. I've done exactly the same thing. I've taken one exposure for the front and one exposure for the back. These were both 3-minute exposures, so it took some time, and the exposure was slightly different during those two frames. So it was getting light, so the things changed a little bit. The back, as you can see, is focused at the back, and the front is super focused on the front, so it's really beautiful foreground. Now, I am not going to do this in such a complicated way. I'm just going to show how easy it can be if you've got water in the frame. So the same thing applies. You absolutely have to align the layers first. You can't just start blending things. So I'm just going to do that step again where I auto-align the layers. I guess in this particular case where you have water in between, you can get away with it, but if you've got a landscape shot, you just cannot. So, if it's all land, you're going to really struggle with that. So now the back and the front are aligned, so I'm just going to unclick that. I'm going to get a mask on the back, and I'm going to say, right, I'm going to paint in the front. So painting in the front means I need to erase the front of this image, and I'll just do that with a black brush. Again, keep the opacity below 100%. And this is just going to paint in the front. I'll just go through and just make sure it's been done correctly. But I'm really not getting into the water because I just want that front to get replaced. Now there is some areas of surf that I do quite like in that other image, but I'm going to really struggle to paint that in without getting into the black areas. Since it's a transition, I might try and use a smaller brush and just get into here and just see if I can paint in some of that surf around those rocks. So this isn't really affecting the land sharpness because that transition is better. So there we go, I managed to paint in a little bit of that nice surf as well. Now what you are going to notice is if I zoom in and click and drag, is there's this little transitional edge along the side there. That is because of the alignment, so we need to fix that. So I'm just going to go layer and flatten image. So we now have a single image, but we need that line sorted out. So I'm just going to go Command A to select all, Command T to create the edges, and you can see there. So I just need to pull down until I can see one of those transform windows, and I'm just going to pull that out a little bit on that side, scroll across to the other side, and it's not so bad on that side, but there is a little line, so I'll pull that across there too. And all that's doing is sorting out those little marks that were difficult. The bottom also has one, so I need to go Command A, Command T again. There we go. And now we have another image that has been focus stacked, but this way manually, but using one of the two steps.